And let me just emphasize what this is and why it, sort of set people's expectation about the strike. There is millions of pounds on the table, and that's your money, right? That's what you have in your contract at the moment. And they're saying, well, we'll have that. And if you don't say anything, they're just going to have it. So the question is, are we going to say anything about it? The USS is forcing through changes in your pension. And in fact, they've already made those changes. So if there's no response, and they forced them through the committee, and so that if there's no response, that's what will happen. But one thing that people need to know is how much do they stand to lose. And I guess, the people that I've talked to fall into two categories. One is young people who aren't worried very much about their pensions. And I certainly understand that. I mean, I've been there, but of course you're going to lose a lot. And then older people who think, well, it's not going to change very much for me. So because the changes are not retroactive. So, I've got mine. And both of those are, probably not ways of thinking about it. Because if you look at how much you stand to lose, it's substantial in both cases. And if you really want to see in your specific case, then I'd say go to the UCU pensions modeler and try that out. And there's two things that you have to look at: a lump sum and your annual payment. And this is a kind of example of what you would see in the UCU modeler. So there's a substantial fall in the annual payment. So this is what your annual pension is. So instead of living on 17,500 pounds a year, you'd be living on 10,000 pounds a year, or 11,000 pounds a year. So that's quite a big drop, especially when you're in that range, right? And then if you look at the lump sum, actually that typically goes up. So on the left is the lump sum that you would get now, which is around 55,000 pounds. And on the right is the proposed lump sum, which is bigger, 126,000 pounds. I mean, it's substantially bigger. So you might think, well, actually, why don't maybe I'm better off with that. And, there are some assumptions that come into all of this. But one way to think about that is to think, well, what could I go out and buy in terms of an annual sum with that lump sum? And you can do that. You can go out to the annuities market and you can buy that amount, you can pay that amount and get an annual sum on the back of that. And 55,000 pounds buys about 1,500 pounds annually, and 126,000 pounds buys about 4,000 pounds annually. But even with the lump sum difference, with the increased lump sum, you end up with a total loss. And the total annual loss is about 4,500 pounds when your annual pension is 19,000 pounds. So on that basis, it's quite a lot of your pension. It's about a quarter of your pension. And these numbers change a little bit over the salary ranges, but they don't change a lot. So that's pretty similar across a wide range of pay grades. And of course, there are, then you think, well, everybody advances as they go through their career. Different people advance at different rates. What about me? Is that going to be different for me? And the thing is that if the loss is pretty similar across all those pay grades, when you model a progressive salary, it also stays pretty much the same. So it doesn't change very much, even if you're advancing through your career. And over your whole retirement, that adds up to a lot. So, it's in this example, it's about 70,000 pounds. If you're on a higher salary, it'll be more. If you're on a lower salary, it'll be somewhat less. But can older staff really think, well, I've just got mine, I don't need to worry about this? And I would suggest that's not really the right thing to think about, because the losses are substantial, even if you're 60. That's sort of me at the moment, right? And I have maybe 6 more years until the official retirement age, and I still would lose 20,000 pounds. So it's a substantial change for everybody. And let me just emphasize what this is and why it, sort of set people's expectation about the strike. There is millions of pounds on the table, And they're just, that's your money, right? That's what you have in your contract at the moment. And they're saying, well, we'll have that. And if you don't say anything, they're just going to have it. So the question is, are we going to say anything about it? The total loss when I modeled a progressive salary where you're going up from lecturer, senior lecturer, and so on. And I never modeled up into the professor range. So this is not based on a high final salary. The total loss is almost 100,000 pounds. But the university will try to make you think that the changes are justified. So they'll say, we just don't have any money. And universities are going to go bust, or the pension fund is going to go bust, and then you won't get anything. And the question is there a problem in the pension fund at the moment? Well, there certainly is no current deficit. So if you look at the liabilities in the most recent assessment, they're 87.7 billion, but the assets are 87.8 billion. Okay, so there's no deficit, there's no current deficit. And that's a little different than the situation that happened at the last valuation, and that they chose, there's no legal obligation at the time they chose to have a valuation, They just chose the time to do it. They could have waited. And the time that they chose was the moment when the stocks were at the bottom of the market, right after COVID struck. So that was a particularly inopportune time to choose to do a valuation. I don't know the motivations for that, but one might speculate. But that's the current situation. Again, the university will always tell you, yeah, but that's what's happening now. And the problem is that when you get to pensionable age, it's going to be different. So then you have to say, well, what's the future value of the scheme going to look like? And the pension fund has to do that too. And that's part of what they do in the valuation. And in order to do that, they have to set some expectation about what they think, how they think their assets will perform. What's going to happen to bonds, what's going to happen to stocks, what will happen to the total value of the fund over time. And if you look at how they've done that in the past, so the real growth rate in the economy is this black line on the plot. In the past, they've used a set of different assumptions for valuing the scheme that are more or less in the range of the real growth rate. They're always a little bit less, but they're not drastically less. This gray bar at the bottom, and it's a bar because it changes a little bit under different assumptions about the covenant, which is another issue. That's their current assumption about the growth rate. So they have assumed that economic growth has stopped and will never restart. So that's the level of the sort of manipulation of the assumptions that's going on. And if you're interested in following that up, there are some references here. You can also look at that historically and say, yeah, well, but maybe recently things haven't been so bad. And if you look really back over time, don't you have some periods that are at least as bad as what they're assuming will happen now? And here's a longer term view. So that goes from 1870, 1870 to 1990. And in that period, we include the Great Depression, what's called the Long Depression, which was at the beginning of the century, 2 world wars. Here's the rate of return on global assets. So on a portfolio that's invested globally, but of course the USS can do that. And the red line that's just above 0 is their assumption about what your pension will return. That's a rate that has never been approached globally over that entire extended period from 1870 on. And we're not the only ones that are saying this. So you might say, well, yeah, but the UCU has a particular perspective. Is that really the right perspective? But Martin Wolf, who's a journalist for the Financial Times, has said that the only assumption under which the USS scheme could fail is a permanent end of economic growth, which is more or less what the employers have assumed. There are some other factors that also make the scheme relatively low risk. So it's a relatively immature scheme, which means that there are lots of new members joining and not so many older members retiring. And it's also a last man standing scheme. So for the whole pension scheme to go bust, all of the universities in the UK would more or less have to go bust at the same time. I mean, if a significant number get in trouble, that will also be a difficulty for the scheme. But you have to have, if one university goes bust, the other ones have to pick up the scheme. And the pension regulations are designed for companies' pension schemes. They're designed to protect a pension if a single company goes bust, and the university sector is not like that. Obviously, if all of the UK universities go bust at the same time, we'll be worrying about other things. We won't be worried about our pensions because there will be a lot more to worry about than that. So the risks that we've looked at are conservative. The ones that we've seen the figures for are conservative, also given these other factors. So there are some very useful resources to look at. I'd say particularly Michael Otsuka and Sam Marsh have done some very good work, but Neil Davies' article about the historical returns is also a very good one.
With our brothers and our sisters, together we will stand.